a girl with no home, an officer in peril, and a German shepherd trapped in the trunk of a car. Fate brought them together in a story that would touch the heart of an entire nation. The truth behind this unexpected rescue proved to be even more moving than anyone could have imagined. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment with where you're watching from. Frost blanketed the ground of Don Eusebio's junkyard as Lucia Garcia began her daily search. The sun was still just a promise on the horizon, and the girl blew on her hands, reddened by the biting cold of northern Spain. Her slender fingers, already calloused despite her young age, skillfully sifted through mountains of twisted metal. Every piece of copper she found meant a few more coins for her grandmother Elvira's medicine. San Lorenzo was slowly waking as Lucia made her way to the back of the lot, an area Don Eusebio rarely visited. Here, among rusted-out carcasses and abandoned parts, the scrap metal told silent stories of past lives. The girl knew every corner of this metallic labyrinth better than her own small shack. That's when a strange sound broke the morning silence, a muffled groan, followed by a weak snarl. Lucia froze, clutching the small bag of her findings to her chest. The noise was coming from an old seat covered by a torn tarp, forgotten for months in this corner of the junkyard. "Is anyone there?" she whispered, approaching with hesitant steps. The sound intensified, a human groan and a canine whimper, mixed in desperation. Curiosity overcame fear, and Lucia pulled back the dusty tarp. The vehicle's trunk was closed, but the sounds were clearly coming from inside. Without a second thought, the girl picked up a rusty bolt from the ground and turned it into a makeshift tool. Her trembling hands worked at the lock for long minutes, beads of sweat trickling down her forehead despite the cold. With a metallic click, the trunk finally gave way. Lucia took a step back, startled by what she saw. A man in a police uniform lay gagged and bound, with dried blood on his face. Beside him, equally trapped, was a formidable German shepherd with dark fur, whimpering softly, one paw clearly injured. "Please help," the man murmured, once Lucia removed the cloth from his mouth. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping a safe distance. "Javier Moreno, Municipal Police," he answered in a hoarse voice. "And this is Rex, my partner. We need to get out of here. They could come back." The dog's eyes met Lucia's with a mix of pain and hope that the girl would never forget. In that moment, she didn't know that this encounter would forever change her life in the small Spanish village. She only knew she had to act fast, before Don Eusebio appeared, or before those responsible for this cruelty returned. Javier Moreno tried to lift himself from the trunk, but his body protested with sharp pains. In a weak, hoarse voice, he tried to warn his little rescuer. "Be careful, girl. They could return at any moment." Lucia wasted no time on words. Her nimble fingers, accustomed to sorting metals in Don Eusebio's junkyard, worked quickly on the ropes binding the German shepherd. Rex, despite a visibly injured front paw and fur matted with dried blood, found the strength to lick the girl's hand in a silent gesture of gratitude. "We need to get out of here now," she whispered, helping the officer out of the rusted vehicle. The sound of heavy footsteps and the creak of the main gate froze the three in place. Someone had arrived. Javier tried to stand, leaning on the abandoned car, but his legs gave way. Lucia signaled for them to be silent and pointed to a path between the piles of scrap. "Follow me," she murmured, crouching low. "I know this place like the back of my hand." The girl guided the injured man and the dog through a labyrinth of metal carcasses and discarded parts. Every step was a challenge for Javier, who bit his lip to keep from groaning in pain. Rex, though limping, remained alert, his ears tuned to any suspicious sound. They reached a partially collapsed wire fence at the back of the property. Lucia carefully pulled back the twisted wires, creating an opening just large enough for them to pass through. On the other side, just a few yards away, stood an abandoned shed with faded wooden walls and a partially collapsed roof. "No one will find us there," she explained, helping the officer through the gap in the fence. The inside of the shed smelled of mildew and dust. A few rays of sun pierced through the gaps in the roof, partially illuminating the dirt floor. Javier staggered to a darker corner and slid down the wall, exhausted. Rex lay down beside him, panting. "Thank you," the officer managed to murmur, before his eyes grew heavy. "You saved our lives." Lucia watched the man faint, his breathing ragged, and his forehead covered in sweat. Without hesitation, the little girl took off running towards the shack where she lived with her grandmother, Elvira. She needed clean water, some food, and at least one blanket, even if it was torn. As she ran, the girl felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She didn't know who this police officer was, nor why he was locked in a trunk, but her gut told her she had done the right thing. And now, for better or for worse, their destinies were intertwined. As the first rays of sun broke, Lucia Garcia was dragging Javier Moreno's injured body along the dirt path that led to her home. Rex, the German shepherd, limped beside them, alert to any suspicious movement. The shack of wood and tin, where the girl lived with her grandmother, was hidden among dry trees in the most remote part of the village of San Lorenzo. "Grandma, I need help!" Lucia shouted, pushing the door open with her shoulder. Elvira, a woman with graying hair and calloused hands, rose with difficulty from her rocking chair. Her eyes widened at the sight of the bloodied police officer being dragged in by her granddaughter. Despite her wheezing breath and the cough that constantly troubled her, the old woman did not hesitate. "Put him on my bed," she ordered with a firm voice, already moving to get clean water and cloths. The dog positioned himself beside his owner, occasionally licking his hand as if trying to wake him. Elvira examined Javier's injuries with the experience of someone who had tended to many wounds throughout her life. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were precise as she cleaned the cuts and applied a paste of herbs she kept in a clay pot. "Do you know this man, Grandma?" Lucia asked, noticing the look of recognition on her grandmother's face. The old woman simply nodded, continuing her work in silence. She prepared a bitter herbal tea that she managed to get Javier to swallow, even in his unconscious state. For the animal, she offered water and a piece of dried meat she saved for special occasions. "Absolute silence from now on," Elvira whispered, closing the tattered curtains. "No one can know they are here." When she finished the dressings, the grandmother sat beside her granddaughter on the dirt floor. Her tired eyes met the girls, and a silent communication passed between them. It wasn't the first time they had sheltered someone in danger, but they had never risked so much. "He is a good man," Elvira finally murmured, looking at the sleeping officer. "But whoever put him in that trunk holds power in this town." Lucia stroked the head of Rex, who had lain down beside her as if he had known her for years. "Then we'll have to be smarter than them," the girl replied, determination in her eyes. The old woman smiled faintly, recognizing in her granddaughter the same courage she herself once had. As night fell over the small shack, the two women stood guard, knowing they had crossed a dangerous line, but also that compassion was, at times, the only possible choice. For 10 days, Elvira's small shack became a silent refuge. Javier Moreno remained on a makeshift mattress, suffering from an intermittent fever and pains he tried to hide. Rex, equally wounded, never left his side, licking his own wounds and keeping a watchful eye on any suspicious movement. Lucia observed everything with a natural suspicion. Despite her fear, the girl religiously brought stale bread she got from the neighborhood bakery and prepared thin, hot chocolate, always dividing the portions equally among them all. Elvira, with her wrinkled and trembling hands, changed the makeshift bandages and whispered words of comfort. "I need to get back to the station," the officer would mutter in his lucid moments, trying to get up only to be gently pushed back onto the mattress by the old woman. "Not yet, son. They're still looking for you," Lucia's grandmother would reply, adjusting the torn blanket over the injured man. On the cold nights of San Lorenzo, when the north wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden walls, Javier would talk in his sleep. Names, places, and fragments of conversations escaped his feverish lips. Lucia, sitting in a corner of the room with a thin blanket over her shoulders, absorbed every word, assembling a mental puzzle. Velasco, betrayal, the warehouse, documents. The girl began to slip through the village streets, her ears open to the adults' conversations. At the market, in the square, near the police station, everywhere there were whispers about the disappearance of the honest police officer and his dog. Some said Javier had fled with stolen money, others that he had been the victim of a settling of scores. Rex was recovering faster than his owner. The German shepherd could already limp to the door, where he stood alert, as if on guard duty. The animal would only accept food after everyone else had eaten, affectionately licking Lucia's hand when she offered him clean water. On one particularly quiet afternoon, Javier finally managed to sit up. His eyes, once clouded by fever, now showed renewed determination. "Someone in the force betrayed me," he said, stroking Rex's head. "Someone close to Ramon Velasco." Elvira and Lucia exchanged worried glances. The girl bit her lip, hesitant, before revealing, "The people in the square say the police chief has offered a reward for information about you. They say you stole something important." Javier smiled sadly, shaking his head. "I didn't steal it. I discovered it. And that makes all the difference." That night, while everyone slept, Lucia stayed awake, watching the police officer and his faithful canine companion. For the first time in her short life, she felt she was at the center of something much larger than herself, something dangerous, but also important. The rain fell mercilessly on the roof of the small shack, creating a curtain of water that isolated Lucia Garcia and her companions from the outside world. That's when the girl noticed strange shadows moving among the trees near the house. Her heart pounded as she slowly backed away from the window. "There's someone out there," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Rex, his paw still bandaged, perked up his ears and began to growl softly. The German shepherd, though injured, assumed an alert stance. The fur on his neck bristled as his eyes fixed on the door with intensity. Javier Moreno, who could now sit up without as much pain, signaled for everyone to remain silent. The officer dragged himself to the window and peered discreetly through the torn curtains. "Turn off all the lights, Elvira," he instructed in a low, firm voice, "and stay away from the windows." The old woman obeyed promptly, moving with an agility her frail health allowed. As darkness enveloped the room, Javier reached for an old police radio that Lucia had brought days earlier. With skillful fingers, he adjusted the frequency, trying to pick up any communication that might reveal who was lurking outside. "It could be Velasco's men," he murmured, referring to the corrupt chief. Or maybe just curious onlookers. Either way, we can't take any chances. Elvira sat in a corner, her wrinkled hands clasped in silent prayer. Her lips moved without a sound, as a rosary slipped through her fingers. The old woman's calm contrasted with the tension that hung in the air. Lucia couldn't stay still. The little girl crept to the door and, with extreme care, peeked through a crack. Two men were talking in low voices near the gate, sheltered by dark raincoats. One of them held what looked like a flashlight, occasionally pointing it towards the house. "Are they armed?" asked Javier, who was now positioned behind her. The girl shook her head, uncertain. Fear was a knot in her throat, preventing her from speaking. Yet there was something different about this moment, a strange sense of belonging. Here, in this precarious shack, surrounded by danger, they formed an unlikely family. Rex approached silently and nudged Lucia's hand with his snout, as if to reassure her. The girl stroked the animal's head, finding comfort in his damp fur. "We won't let them find us," Javier promised, placing a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "We're in this together." The shadows lingered for nearly an hour, a stretch of time that felt like an eternity to the four refugees, bound by fate and the secret they shared. 3 soft knocks on the door made Lucia and Elvira freeze. Rex, still weak, perked up his ears, and Javier signaled for silence. When the rhythmic sequence repeated, the police officer recognized the code and nodded for Elvira to open the door, keeping himself hidden behind the peeling wall. Carla Jimenez slipped inside, dressed in simple clothes, a scarf partially covering her face. She hugged Javier with visible relief, her professional gaze assessing her colleague's condition with concern. She carried an ordinary shopping bag, the perfect disguise for the medicine and supplies hidden within. "The station is in chaos," she whispered, pulling vials and gauze from the bag. "Velasco is telling everyone you fled after stealing evidence. Some believe it, others are suspicious, but no one dares question him openly." Elvira prepared a pot of tea while Carla applied ointment to Rex's wounds. The agent explained that documents had been forged, witnesses intimidated, and Javier's name was being smeared more each day. Lucia watched it all with keen eyes, absorbing every word, every gesture. "Marco is trying to find out who else is involved," the visitor explained, accepting the cup offered by the old woman. "We suspect the network is bigger than we imagined." Javier ran a frustrated hand through his hair. "I have to go back. I have to clear my name." "Don't even think about it," Carla cut in sharply. "Velasco has already ordered your immediate arrest, or maybe even your elimination." The officer pulled a crumpled brown envelope from her pocket and handed it to Javier. Inside were several euro notes and a disposable phone. "Use this only for emergencies," she instructed. "Only call the numbers already saved. One is mine, the other is Marco's." Elvira took the envelope with trembling hands, hiding it inside an old cookie tin. Lucia remained silent, but her eyes revealed a stark understanding of their predicament. Before leaving, Carla crouched in front of the girl. Her eyes, usually hardened by her profession, softened as they met the child's gaze. "You were so brave, saving them," she said in a low voice. "But you have to be even stronger now." Standing, the agent adjusted her scarf and addressed them all. "Don't trust anyone but me and Marco. Absolutely no one." She looked pointedly at Lucia and added, "And watch over the girl. She's seen too much now." When the door closed, the silence pressed down on them. Elvira wrapped her arms around her granddaughter, while Javier exchanged a look with Rex. The danger that surrounded him had just become terrifyingly real. On the third night after the escape, Lucia Garcia sat on the worn wooden floor of the small living room, stroking Rex as the German shepherd rested. Her thin fingers ran through the dog's fur when something unusual caught her attention. A small, hard lump stitched into the worn leather collar. The girl frowned, her curiosity piqued. "There's something in here," she murmured, examining it more closely. Javier Moreno, watching from a corner of the room, approached quickly. The officer still moved with difficulty, but his eyes widened when he saw what the girl had found. "Wait, let me see that," he said, kneeling with effort beside them. With nimble hands, Lucia found a nearly invisible seam on the inside of the collar. Using a needle borrowed from Elvira, she carefully picked the hidden stitches open. From within, she pulled out a minuscule memory card, no bigger than her thumbnail. "Did you know about this?" she asked, handing the object to him. Javier held the device with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred relic. "Yes and no," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I put this in Rex's collar as a last resort, but in all the chaos, I completely forgot." Elvira entered the room just then, carrying a cup of herbal tea for him. Seeing the tiny object in the officer's hands, she set the cup down on the makeshift table and drew near, her expression grave. "This is all the evidence against Velasco and his accomplices," Javier explained. "Payment logs, photos of meetings with traffickers, recorded conversations. Everything we need to bring down this entire web of corruption." Rex, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, lifted his head and looked at his owner with attentive eyes. "This is too dangerous," Elvira whispered, instinctively glancing toward the window, which was covered by a tattered cloth. "If they find out it's here." The old woman didn't need to finish the sentence. The heavy silence that followed said everything. Lucia stared at the small object with a mixture of fascination and fear. Something so tiny held the power to change so many lives, including her own. "We need to hide this, and hide it well," her grandmother said, finally taking the card from Javier's hand. "I know a place where no one would ever think to look." As Elvira walked away to secure the precious item, the girl noticed the worried look her grandmother cast in her direction. It wasn't just fear for her own safety, but a profound terror for what could happen to her granddaughter. Lucia felt the weight of that look. She had seen too much. She knew too much. And now she was irrevocably tangled in a dangerous battle against powerful people. Rex moved closer and licked her hand, as if to comfort her. The girl hugged the animal, finding in him a courage she never knew she possessed. The afternoon sun filtered through the torn curtains of the small shack. Javier Moreno sat at the makeshift table, examining the memory card with a worried expression as Rex dozed at his feet. Elvira, her shoulders stooped with the weight of her years, poured herbal tea into chipped mugs. Her trembling hands betrayed not just her age, but the anxiety she carried. "I have to tell you something," the old woman murmured, seating herself with difficulty on the rickety wooden chair. "I've known Ramon Velasco for longer than he realizes." The officer looked up, surprised. The old woman explained that for nearly 8 years, she had worked as a cleaner in the police chief's residence. Her hands had wiped every corner of that imposing house in the San Lorenzo Hills, including the private study where Velasco kept his darkest secrets. "He never noticed me," Elvira continued, a different light in her eyes. "To men like him, people like me are invisible. But I saw documents. I overheard phone calls while I was dusting the shelves. I knew something was wrong. But who would believe a cleaning lady?" Javier gently squeezed her hand. Why didn't you ever report it? I have Lucia to protect, she answered simply. When I found papers with the names of officers and amounts in euros, I understood I was dealing with something dangerous. The next day, I made an excuse and I never went back to that house. From a corner of the room, partially hidden behind a faded curtain, Lucia listened in absolute silence. The girl who had always seen her grandmother as a simple woman without secrets was now discovering another side to the woman who had raised her alone. There was a false drawer in his desk, Elvira went on, lowering her voice. And behind the family portrait, there's a safe. I know the combination. It was his daughter's date of birth. Javier quickly jotted the information on the back of a scrap of paper. Rex lifted his head, as if he too understood the importance of the moment. Why are you telling me this now? The officer asked. Elvira's tired eyes met Javier's. Because now you have the card with the proof, and I have the way to get more. Maybe it's time we ended his reign over this city. A shiver ran down Lucia's spine. She saw a determination in her grandmother's face she had never noticed before. In that instant, the girl understood that the secrets of her family and Javier's were now interwoven by the invisible threads of fate. Past and present were connecting right there, in that humble room, forging an unavoidable path for all their futures. The knocks on the door came in a specific pattern. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 slow ones. Javier Moreno immediately recognized the code he used with his old partner. Elvira, cautious, peeked through a crack before opening the door for Marco Diaz, who hurried inside carrying a bag of groceries. I brought what I could without raising suspicion, Marco said, placing bread, milk, and some medicine on the table. His tired eyes revealed a sleepless night. The whole town is on alert. Velasco is offering 500 euros for any information on your whereabouts. Lucia watched the newcomer with suspicion. The girl had learned not to trust adults easily, especially men in uniform. Marco noticed her stare and offered a gentle smile, pulling a chocolate bar he'd hidden in his pocket for her. How's Rex? He asked, stroking the German shepherd, who, despite his injuries, limped over to sniff an old acquaintance. He's recovering. So am I, Javier replied, gesturing to the makeshift bandages on his own body. What else have you found out? Marco sat at the small table, accepting the glass of water Elvira offered him. The old woman remained silent, but she hung on his every word. Half the precinct buys the official story that you fled after stealing evidence. The other half is too afraid to question it. Carla and I are the only ones who know the truth, and it has to stay that way. Why are you risking yourself for us? Lucia asked, breaking her silence. The direct question made the adults exchange glances. Marco took a deep breath before revealing, I dated Helena Velasco for 3 years. She was the chief's niece, so I got to know the family's secrets. When we broke up, I swore I'd never use what I knew against them, but... He paused. What they did to Javier and Rex crosses every line. That makes you a traitor in their eyes, Elvira murmured, understanding the gravity of the situation. Yes, ma'am. If they find out I'm helping you, I won't just be fired. Velasco has connections all over the north. Javier squeezed his friend's shoulder. I don't want to drag you into this mess. Too late, Marco replied, looking at Lucia with a mixture of admiration and concern. This little one is already at the center of everything, and I can't turn my back on you. Before he left, Marco handed Javier a disposable phone. Emergencies only. Call the number already saved. At the door, he knelt to Lucia's level. I promise we're going to protect you and your grandmother. You have my word. The girl didn't answer. But as Marco disappeared into the darkness, she closed the door with less force than usual. It was a small sign that maybe, just maybe, she could trust one more adult on this perilous journey. Elvira's cough echoed through the small house in the early hours of the morning. Lucia Garcia woke with a start to find her grandmother hunched over, a handkerchief stained with blood in her trembling hands. The girl rushed to get water while Javier Moreno, still moving stiffly from his injuries, tried to help the old woman get more comfortable in her makeshift bed. "It's nothing, just exhaustion," Elvira rasped between coughs. But the look exchanged between Javier and Lucia spoke of the true gravity of the situation. The old woman's health, already fragile before she'd taken in a wounded officer and his dog, was deteriorating rapidly under the weight of the stress and the shack's squalid conditions. The next morning, Lucia wrapped a few coins in a piece of paper and slipped out, heading for the village pharmacy. Rex tried to follow, but the dog was still limping too badly to keep up. The girl hurried through the streets of San Lorenzo with a heavy heart, feeling the suspicious glances that followed her. "I need medicine for a bloody cough," she said timidly to the pharmacist, a middle-aged man who frowned in recognition. "The Junkyard girl," he muttered, as other customers subtly moved away. "Is your grandmother sick? Why don't you take her to the hospital?" Lucia looked down, clutching the coins in her hand. "We can't go right now, please, just the medicine." The pharmacist hesitated, but eventually handed over a small bottle. "This won't solve it. If she's coughing up blood, she needs a doctor." When she returned, Lucia found Javier sitting by Elvira's bed, holding her hand as the old woman struggled to breathe. The officer stood with effort, leaning against the wall. "I promise I'll do everything I can to help you both," he said, his voice thick with a sense of powerlessness. "As soon as I can contact Carla again, I'll ask her to bring better medicine." Elvira tried to get up to prepare something to eat, but her legs gave out. Lucia rushed to support her, feeling her grandmother's body lighter and more fragile than ever. That night, while the old woman finally slept under the effect of the medicine, Javier and Lucia sat at the kitchen table. Rex lay at the girl's feet, as if to offer some comfort. Every one of Elvira's coughs, every creak of the door that might announce danger, every hour that passed with no word from Carla or Marco, deepened the sense that they were trapped. The Sunday market in San Lorenzo was an old tradition, a burst of color and life that broke the gray routine of the small town's narrow streets. For a few hours, Lucia Garcia had managed to escape the tension that hung heavy in her grandmother's home. Elvira had insisted. Her granddaughter needed to buy fresh bread, yes, but more than that, she needed to breathe a little fresh air, to escape the worries that clung to her like a shroud. As Lucia walked among the colorful market stalls, she kept her eyes sharp, a habit learned in childhood. That's when she saw him. Ramon Velasco, an imposing figure in a dark coat, handing out freshly baked loaves to a crowd of children. The police chief smiled broadly, ruffling the little one's hair, occasionally bending down to listen to their whispered words. Lucia froze, ducking behind a fruit stand. This man, the man Javier swore had tried to kill him, seemed so normal, so kind. The scene dredged up a half-forgotten memory. 2 years ago, as she'd been scavenging in the bins behind the central market, Velasco had found her. Instead of chasing her away like the others, he'd offered her half of his sweet roll and asked where she lived. "Do you need help, little one?" he had asked, his eyes holding the same warmth he now showed the children in the square. That gesture of kindness, which had felt like a miracle to a starving girl, was now coated in a cruel irony. The same hand that offered bread was the one that signed orders to silence innocent people. Watching him now, Lucia felt a strange tightness in her chest. It wasn't just fear or anger, but a profound confusion. How could someone be so gentle in public and so monstrous in the shadows? She remembered her grandmother's words. "The devil doesn't come with horns and a tail, my child. He comes with a wide smile and sweet words." When one of the children dropped his bread in a puddle, Velasco immediately offered another, consoling the small boy with a soft voice. The onlookers applauded the gesture, and the police chief gave a humble wave, the very picture of a community benefactor. Lucia backed away slowly, her heart heavy. She bought the bread for Elvira and hurried home, carrying not just a warm loaf, but a new, unsettling understanding. The world wasn't neatly divided into heroes and villains. People were complicated, full of layers and contradictions, and that made everything so much more frightening. The noise from the roof was almost imperceptible, but Rex's ears shot up instantly. The German shepherd, still recovering from his injuries, let out a low growl that made Lucia Garcia approach him cautiously. She stroked the dog's fur, noting his restless state. Rex seemed fixated on one specific point in the room, the old wall clock that had belonged to her grandmother. "What is it, boy?" Lucia whispered, following his gaze. On silent feet, she moved closer to the clock and noticed something odd. A thin, dark wire running discreetly down the wall, nearly invisible against the faded wallpaper. Javier Moreno, who had been resting on the small sofa, saw their agitation and rose with difficulty. The officer examined Lucia's discovery, and his expression hardened. "Don't touch anything," he murmured, motioning for everyone to be quiet. When Marco Diaz arrived hours later, he confirmed their fears. The house was bugged. Javier's friend carefully inspected the device without removing it. "This is police-issue equipment," Marco explained in a low voice, as Elvira served herbal tea with trembling hands. "Someone at the station is monitoring you." Javier ran a hand through his hair, visibly disturbed. "It has to be someone close to Velasco. Maybe Vicente Rojas or one of the new recruits he brought in." Carla Jimenez arrived at dusk, bringing bread and some medicine. When she learned of the bug, her lips tightened into a thin line. "I'll find out who did this," she promised, tucking a burner phone into her pocket. "I have access to the equipment checkout logs." Elvira, sitting in her rocking chair, watched them all with weary eyes. The old woman beckoned them closer. "We must be even more careful," she whispered, her voice so soft they had to lean in to hear. "Speak only what is necessary. Use the bathroom for important conversations. The sound of the water confuses the microphones." That night, no one slept. Lucia stared at the ceiling, imagining how many people were listening to her breathing, her footsteps, her words. The net was closing in around them. Rex lay beside the girl's makeshift bed, as if sensing her anxiety. Javier stood guard by the window, taking turns with Marco. In Elvira's tiny room, Carla helped the old woman with her medication. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every held breath, every exchanged glance carried the weight of fear. They were being watched, and the enemy was drawing closer. Javier Moreno knew the best way to hide was in plain sight. One afternoon, looking out the window at the humble houses of their neighborhood, a brilliant idea struck him. "Let's organize a campaign to repair the neighborhood houses," the officer proposed, stroking Rex, who rested at his side. "That way, No one will question people coming and going from here. Elvira, despite her frail health, smiled in approval. Lucia, initially wary, soon warmed to the idea of fixing the roof that leaked every time it rained. The girl went out into the streets, handing out handwritten notes, inviting neighbors to a meeting. To everyone's surprise, the response was immediate. The next day, 3 neighbors showed up with old but still usable roof tiles. An elderly woman brought a pot of stew, remarking that little Lucia looked thinner than usual. What began as a cover story blossomed into genuine solidarity. Don Eusebio, the owner of the local junkyard, sent over materials and even offered a few tools. For Elvira's granddaughter, anything, said the gray-haired man, who had always had a soft spot for the girl who scavenged through his scrap metal. While the shack received an overhaul, Carla Jimenez worked tirelessly at the station. The officer unearthed a hidden folder in the archives filled with falsified reports. The documents clearly showed how Velasco manipulated evidence and skimmed money from seizures. "Look at this," she showed Marco, during a secret meeting in an abandoned warehouse. He only logged half the cash seized in the raid on the port smugglers. Javier's friend examined the papers carefully. "That explains Vicente's new car. Nobody believed him when he said it was an inheritance from his aunt." When they returned to Elvira's house, they found the roof nearly finished and the walls being painted. Lucia ran back and forth, serving water to the volunteers, a smile on her face that hadn't been there for a long time. That evening, gathered around the makeshift table, Javier realized something important. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," he said, looking out the window at the lights of the neighboring houses. "We're fighting for all of San Lorenzo." Elvira took her granddaughter's hand and squeezed it tightly. "Good people always exist," the old woman murmured. "Sometimes, they just need a chance to show themselves." As Rex slept peacefully at Lucia's feet, the group felt, for the first time in days, that they were not alone in this battle. The city, unknowingly, was beginning to take their side. Carla Jimenez arrived at the hideout, her face pale, her hands trembling. Without a word, she tossed an envelope onto the makeshift table. Javier picked it up and felt his stomach drop as he read its contents. An official promotion for Carla, signed by Ramon Velasco, with an implicit condition of absolute silence on the case. "He called me into his office personally," she said, running her fingers nervously through her hair. "He smiled like we were old friends while he offered me the sub-chief position." Lucia, who had been playing with Rex in the corner, stopped to watch the adults. The girl had developed a sixth sense for trouble. "And what did you say?" Javier asked, dreading the answer. The officer pulled a lighter from her pocket, flicked it on with a sharp movement, and brought the flame to the document. "This is what I think of his offer," she declared, as the paper turned to ash before their eyes. Elvira, observing from her rocking chair, nodded in approval. The old woman knew the price of dignity in difficult times. "You didn't have to do that," Javier murmured, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. "You're risking your career, your safety." "Don't insult me," Carla cut in. "I became a police officer to protect people like Lucia and Elvira, not to cower before thugs in uniform." News of Carla's refusal spread quickly through the department. Marco showed up the next day, reporting that the station was divided. Some officers were beginning to question Velasco's orders, while others, loyal to the chief, grew even more hostile. "Vicente is furious," Marco said, referring to the corrupt chief's right-hand man. "He told everyone that you and Carla are traitors who deserve to be hunted down." Javier stared out the window, feeling responsible for dragging so many people into his mess. The weight of it all threatened to crush him. Maybe I should turn myself in, he suggested in a low voice. End this once and for all. Don't even think it, Lucia exclaimed, surprising everyone with her vehemence. The girl, who rarely showed such emotion, grabbed Javier's arm fiercely. You're innocent. My grandmother always says that truth is like water. It always finds a way. Elvira smiled proudly at her granddaughter as Rex moved closer, resting his head on Javier's lap in a gesture of comfort. Carla exchanged a meaningful look with Marco, then turned back to the group. The girl is right. We're 4 officers against a corrupt system, but we have something Velasco doesn't have: the truth. And now, we also have people willing to fight for it. The orange sky announced the end of the afternoon as 3 shadows fell upon Elvira's home. Vicente Rojas, Ramon Velasco's right-hand man, led 2 burly men, their faces set in grim determination. Without warning, they kicked in the flimsy door, which gave way with a splintering crash. Lucia Garcia was in the small kitchen preparing broth for her grandmother when the sound paralyzed her. Elvira, lying on a mattress in the corner, sat up in alarm, her pale face a mask of terror. "Where's the cop and the card?" Vicente roared, storming into the room as his cronies began tearing through the family's few belongings. Rex, who had been resting at Elvira's feet, sprang up. Despite his still limping leg and recent scars, the German shepherd placed himself between the intruders and Lucia, growling fiercely. The girl backed against the wall, trembling, her eyes desperately searching for anything she could use as a weapon. "We don't know anything. Leave us alone," the old woman pleaded, trying to stand. Vicente pulled a gun, pointing it at Rex. "Shut that dog up, or I'll put it down right now." The animal lunged, ignoring the threat. One of the men kicked him, but Rex managed to sink his teeth into the man's arm. A shot echoed through the room. The bullet grazed the shepherd's flank, and he yelped in pain, but he did not back down. Lucia screamed, rushing to protect the dog. Vicente grabbed the girl violently by the arm, making her cry out. "You're going to tell us where Javier hid that card, or your grandmother is going to suffer the consequences." Just then, the back door burst open. Marco Diaz and Carla Jimenez appeared, she with her gun drawn, he wielding a heavy piece of wood. "Let the girl go, Vicente. Now!" Carla commanded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The officer kept her weapon trained as Marco moved to stand beside Rex. The intruders hesitated, sizing up the new odds. "This isn't over," Vicente threatened, releasing Lucia's arm. "Velasco knows you're here. It's only a matter of time." The 3 men backed away slowly and left, leaving chaos and fear in their wake. Elvira collapsed the moment they were gone. Her breathing was weaker than ever. Lucia rushed to her grandmother, clutching her wrinkled hand, while Marco checked Rex's wound. "We have to get them out of here," Carla whispered, peering through the window to make sure the men had gone. Lucia hugged her unconscious grandmother, silent tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she felt the crushing, absolute weight of their situation. This was no longer just about hiding a policeman and his dog. It was about surviving in a world where children like her had no voice and no protection. The knock on the door came far too early. Lucia Garcia, who was sweeping the floor of the small room, froze when she saw 2 social workers standing in the doorway, their expressions severe, a file folder in hand. The man in the gray suit held out an official paper. "We have a warrant to take the minor, Lucia Garcia, into temporary state custody. We've received reports of neglect and an unsuitable living environment," he announced, his voice monotone, as if this were just another bureaucratic procedure. Elvira, coughing in the other room, dragged herself to the door, leaning against the walls for support. Her pale face was a stark contrast to the fire in her eyes. "Please don't take my granddaughter," the old woman begged, clinging to the doorframe to keep from falling. "She's all I have." The younger female worker, her hair in a tight bun, consulted her notes. "Ma'am, our report states that you live in precarious conditions, without adequate access to food and basic care. The girl is often absent from school and has been seen scavenging at the junkyard." Javier Moreno, who had been resting in the back room, emerged cautiously. Though still recovering from his injuries, his presence commanded an immediate respect. He sized up the situation in an instant. "I am a law enforcement officer," he stated, his voice firm. "I can attest that this family is experiencing a temporary hardship, but this child receives all the care she needs." The social workers hesitated. The woman frowned. "Sir, you shouldn't be here. There's a missing person alert out for you." At that moment, Rex appeared at his owner's side, limping slightly. The German shepherd positioned himself protectively near Lucia, who wrapped her arms around the animal's neck. As if answering an unseen call, neighbors began to approach. Dona Mercedes, the baker, brought fresh bread. Senor Tomas, a retired carpenter, arrived carrying a toolbox, explaining he was helping with home repairs. Other residents appeared, each bringing something: food, clothes, school supplies. "We are all looking after them," an elderly woman explained. "This girl saved a police officer and his dog. She is a hero to our community." Visibly flustered by the spontaneous show of support, the officials backed down. The man put away the court order. "We will return for a reassessment in 2 weeks," he warned, adjusting his tie. "We expect to see significant improvements." When they left, Elvira collapsed into a chair, exhausted. Lucia held her wrinkled hand as the neighbors organized the donations. Javier watched the scene with a mix of relief and concern. "They'll be back," he murmured to Marco, who had just arrived. "And next time, we'll need more than the goodwill of our neighbors." "Then we have 2 weeks to bring down Velasco," Marco replied, his voice filled with determination. "Or we lose the girl forever." Tension simmered in the central square of San Lorenzo that afternoon. Javier Moreno, the marks of his assault still visible, climbed onto a small, makeshift stage. Beside him, Rex stood alert, sensing the gravity of the moment. Carla and Marco positioned themselves strategically in the crowd, ready to intervene. "Citizens of San Lorenzo," the officer began, his voice steady. "I have been accused of crimes I did not commit. But I am not here today to defend myself. I am here to reveal the truth about who truly runs the crime in this city." With a calculated gesture, he held up the small memory card Lucia had found in Rex's collar. The girl watched from a corner, beside her grandmother Elvira, who, despite her frailty, insisted on witnessing the moment. "On this device," Javier announced, as images were projected onto a large makeshift screen, "are records of every illicit operation commanded by Chief Ramon Velasco for the past 3 years. The crowd gasped as they saw documents, photos, and recordings that proved the mishandling of seized evidence, the extortion of local merchants, and even involvement in drug trafficking. But the greatest shock came when images appeared of Mayor Eduardo Sanchez accepting envelopes in secret meetings with Velasco. "Our own mayor," a woman next to Lucia whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. Vicente Rojas tried to rush the stage but was restrained by Marco and 2 other officers who had decided to support the cause. Meanwhile, Carla distributed printed copies of the evidence to local journalists who were recording everything. I was left for dead in an abandoned car when I discovered this proof, Javier continued. And if it weren't for a brave child, Rex and I would not be here today. All eyes turned to Lucia, who shrank shyly beside her grandmother. The girl from the junkyard, once invisible to the city, was now recognized as its hero. The next day, the scandal was on the front page of the local paper. Corruption in San Lorenzo Police and City Hall, the truth revealed. On the streets, stunned residents discussed how they had been deceived for so long. Ramon Velasco was arrested while trying to flee the city, and the mayor announced his resignation amidst public protests. The town, once silenced by fear, was now demanding justice loud and clear. For Lucia, watching from her window, it was just the beginning of a new story. Not just for San Lorenzo, but for herself. Night fell on San Lorenzo, bringing a heavy silence. On the very same day that Javier Moreno had exposed Velasco's crimes, Elvira collapsed on the kitchen floor. Her frail body, long worn by years of hard labor, seemed to have used its last ounce of strength to witness that moment of justice. Lucia rushed to her grandmother, holding the woman's wrinkled hand between her own small ones. With tears in her eyes, she helped Carla and Marco move the elderly woman to the old sofa. Rex, still limping, patted over and rested his muzzle on Elvira's arm, as if he understood. "Grandma, hold on," Lucia whispered, as Javier spoke quickly into his phone, calling for an ambulance. Elvira's breathing was shallow, but her eyes were alert, fixed on the granddaughter she loved so dearly. That's when Lucia had an idea. She ran to a small cabinet and pulled out a book of stories a teacher had given her months ago. She had never read aloud to anyone. Shame and the fear of making a mistake had always stopped her. But now, sitting beside her grandmother, Lucia opened the book to a marked page. "I want to read to you, Grandma," she said, her voice trembling. As Carla held Elvira's hand and Marco watched the scene with respect, Lucia began. She stumbled over the first few words, but then, as she narrated the story of a little star that lit the way for lost travelers, her voice grew in confidence. A weary smile formed on Elvira's lips, and a single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. By the time the ambulance finally arrived, Lucia had finished the entire story. The paramedics worked quickly, placing her grandmother on a stretcher. Lucia stayed by her side, holding her hand until the very last moment. "You're going to be okay, I promise," she said, trying to convince herself as much as her grandmother. In the cold hospital corridor, as they waited for news, a deep fear grew in Lucia's chest. The thought of losing Elvira, her only family, felt unbearable. Javier placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but beneath the fear and anguish, there was something else, a quiet pride that warmed Lucia's heart. Her voice, so often ignored, had finally been heard, not just by her grandmother, but by the entire city. Elvira's sacrifice would not be in vain. The truth, now exposed, could never be buried again. News of Ramon Velasco's arrest spread through San Lorenzo like wildfire. Residents gathered in the central square to watch the police chief, head bowed and hands cuffed, being escorted away by federal agents. Vicente Rojas and 3 other corrupt officers followed, as television cameras recorded the historic moment. In a brief, tense address, Mayor Alberto Sanchez announced his resignation. The evidence from Rex's memory card had exposed his role in embezzling public funds and colluding with Velasco. Javier Moreno received his badge back in a simple ceremony at the reformed police station. Carla Jimenez, now promoted to deputy chief, was the first to shake his hand, her tear-filled eyes saying more than words ever could. Marco Diaz watched from a distance, smiling discreetly, knowing his testimony had been crucial in dismantling the operation. "I think we have a family to build," Javier said, as he signed the first of Lucia's adoption papers. The girl, sitting beside him in the social worker's office, held onto Rex's paw. The German shepherd, no longer limping, had become a symbol of resistance, receiving affection from everyone who passed by. The neighbors, once indifferent, now treated Lucia and Elvira like family. Women brought homemade bread, men offered to fix the roof, and children invited Lucia to play. The community, once fractured by fear, was finding a new beginning in reconciliation. "Do you think Grandma would be happy?" Lucia asked one afternoon, as she helped Carla plant flowers in the small garden of their repaired home. "I'm sure of it," the officer replied, pulling the little girl into a hug. Elvira always knew this day would come. She held on just long enough to see justice begin. At the regional court, a judge ruled that the assets seized from Velasco and his accomplices would be used to improve the neighborhood where Lucia grew up. The first project, suggested by the neighbors themselves, would be a community center named after Elvira. Rex, lying on the porch of the police station, with his new, shiny collar, watched children playing without fear in the square. The dog, once wounded and hidden, now received treats from every shopkeeper and had become the town's official mascot. His joyful bark echoed through the streets of San Lorenzo, a sound that announced justice had finally found its way home. 6 months had passed. The small house where Lucia and her grandmother lived was utterly transformed. What was once a precarious shack now boasted freshly painted walls and a roof that no longer leaked. The people of San Lorenzo, moved by the story of the courageous little girl, had joined together for weekend work parties to rebuild it. Don Eusebio's junkyard, for so long a source of survival and later a hiding place, was now just a memory, a symbol of the journey they had all traveled. On that sunny Sunday afternoon, Lucia sat on the new front porch, tying the laces of the sneakers Carla had given her a month ago. Rex, fully recovered, rested lazily at her side, his head occasionally lifting to watch the birds. The German shepherd had become not just a local hero, but the faithful guardian of Lucia's home and her heart. Javier Moreno leaned against the newly painted gate, watching them with a quiet smile. Now reinstated with honors, his face no longer carried the marks of suffering, only a few scars that told a story of survival. He checked his watch. Marco and Carla would be arriving soon for the Sunday lunch that had become their tradition. From the kitchen window, Elvira waved to her granddaughter as she put the finishing touches on a stew. Her health had improved dramatically since she began receiving proper care. Now the elderly woman could dedicate herself to what she loved most, caring for the family that had formed around them. "Grandma says lunch is almost ready," Lucia called out to Javier, who nodded in reply. After tying her shoes, Lucia looked out at the peaceful street. The neighboring houses, once filled with suspicion, now kept their doors and hearts open. The local children called her over to play, and the adults greeted her by name. For the first time in her life, Lucia felt she truly belonged. This wasn't just a renovated house. It was a home, built on courage, loyalty, and love. As she stroked Rex's head and watched Javier approach with a smile, she knew one thing for certain. Together, as the unlikely family they had become, they could face anything the world sent their way.